I never thought I would be the kind of person who could look at someone I once loved and feel nothing but ice in my veins. I never imagined that a woman who had held me as a baby, who had sent me birthday cards with pressed flowers inside them, who had cried at my graduation and called me her favorite niece, would one day try to take everything my parents had worked their entire lives to build. But that is exactly what happened. And if you stay with me through this story, you will understand not only how she tried to destroy my family's legacy, but how her own words, written in her own hand, became the weapon that brought her entire scheme crashing down around her. My name is Emma, and I am 28 years old. I grew up in a quiet town in Connecticut, the kind of place where everyone knows your name and your parents' names, and probably your grandparents' names too. My father, Richard Collins, built a small construction company from nothing. He started with a single truck and a toolbox when he was 23 years old, and by the time I was born, Collins Construction was one of the most respected firms in the state. He built schools, hospitals, community centers. He was the kind of man who would stay late on a job site just to make sure the work was perfect, who would shake the hand of every single worker at the end of a project and thank them personally. My mother, Helen, had been a teacher before she married my father, and even after she stopped working to raise me and my brother Michael, she never stopped teaching. She taught us kindness, patience, how to see the best in people even when they made it difficult. My brother Michael is 4 years younger than me. He is the gentlest person I have ever known. While I was always the practical one, the one who would argue and fight and push back, Michael was the peacemaker. He believed in second chances, in forgiveness, in the fundamental goodness of people. That belief nearly cost us everything. And then there was Aunt Sandra, my father's younger sister. Growing up, she was like a glamorous mystery that would sweep into our lives a few times a year, always with exotic gifts from whatever city she was living in at the time, always with stories about art galleries and parties and famous people she had met. She had never married, never had children, and she treated me and Michael like we were the closest thing she had to her own kids. Or so I thought. I need you to understand how much I loved her. I need you to understand how completely I trusted her. Because without that context, you cannot possibly grasp the depth of the betrayal that came later. The trouble started, as trouble so often does, with death. My mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer when I was 26 years old. It was aggressive, brutal, and merciless. From diagnosis to death, we had exactly 4 months. 4 months to watch this vibrant, beautiful woman fade away in a hospital bed. 4 months to say goodbye when goodbye could never possibly be enough. My father was destroyed, not just sad, destroyed. They had been married for 32 years, and I do not think he ever really understood how to exist without her. He went through the motions for about a year after she passed. He showed up at the office, he answered phone calls, he came to Sunday dinners at my apartment, but the light in his eyes was gone. The man who had built an empire with his bare hands seemed lost, like a ship without an anchor. And then, 18 months after my mother died, my father had a heart attack in his sleep. He was 58 years old. He never woke up. I got the call at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday. I remember the weather was beautiful, bright sunshine, birds singing outside my window. I remember thinking how strange it was that the world could be so beautiful on the worst day of my life. Michael called me, sobbing so hard I could barely understand him. Our housekeeper, Maria, had found Dad in his bed. The paramedics said it was quick, that he probably did not suffer. I do not know if that is supposed to make it easier. It did not. The funeral was 5 days later. It was a larger affair than my mother's had been, because half the construction industry in Connecticut came to pay their respects. People I had never met shook my hand and told me stories about how my father had helped them, given them jobs when no one else would, mentored them when they were young. I stood there in my black dress, accepting condolences, feeling like I was watching my own life from somewhere outside my body, and then Aunt Sandra arrived. She swept in like a storm, dramatic in her grief, clutching a handkerchief to her face, wailing about her dear, dear brother. I remember being momentarily annoyed at how theatrical it all seemed, but I pushed that thought aside. Everyone grieves differently, I told myself. She had just lost her only sibling. Of course she was devastated. After the funeral, after the reception at our family home, after the endless parade of casseroles and flower arrangements and sympathy cards, the real business began. My father had been a meticulous man, organized to a fault, and his will was no different. He had updated it after my mother's death, making sure everything was in order, making sure Michael and I would be taken care of. Patricia Webb was my father's attorney and had been for over 20 years. She was a sharp woman in her early 60s, with silver hair she wore in a sleek bob, and reading glasses she was constantly pushing up her nose. She had been a friend of my parents, had come to their anniversary parties, had sent flowers when my mother passed. I trusted her implicitly. She asked me, Michael, and Aunt Sandra to come to her office a week after the funeral. It was a formality, she explained. The will was straightforward. My father had left the house, the business, and all his financial assets to be split equally between me and Michael. There was a small bequest for Maria, who had worked for our family for 15 years, and a charitable donation to the hospital that had cared for my mother. Aunt Sandra was not mentioned. This did not strike me as strange at the time. My father and Sandra had not been particularly close in recent years. They spoke on holidays, saw each other at family events, but there was always a distance there that I did not fully understand. I assumed he had simply never thought to include her, or perhaps he knew that she had always been comfortable financially and did not need the help. I was wrong about so many things. The reading of the will happened on a Thursday afternoon. Patricia's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, with creaky wooden floors and walls lined with leather-bound law books. Michael and I sat on one side of her massive mahogany desk. Aunt Sandra sat on the other side, clutching her purse in her lap, her face carefully neutral. Patricia read through the legal language, the definitions and declarations that precede any will, and then she got to the bequests. I, Richard Thomas Collins, being of sound mind and body, do hereby leave my entire estate, including all real property, business interests, financial accounts, and personal effects, to be divided equally between my two children, Emma Grace Collins and Michael James Collins. There was a long pause. I looked at Michael. He looked at me. We both looked at Aunt Sandra. Her face had gone completely white. Her hands were trembling, and in her eyes I saw something I had never seen before, something cold and calculating, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Patricia continued reading, explaining the executor responsibilities, the timeline for probate, the logistics of transferring assets. But I was not listening anymore. I was watching my aunt, watching the way her jaw tightened, the way her fingers dug into the leather of her purse. When Patricia finished, Aunt Sandra stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Her voice was sweet, controlled, but underneath it I could hear something dangerous. "Well," she said, "I suppose I should not be surprised. Richard always did favor his children over his own blood sister." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. "The will reflects Richard's wishes," she said carefully. "He was very clear about his intentions." Aunt Sandra's smile did not reach her eyes. Of course he was. Richard was always very clear about what he wanted, even when what he wanted was unfair. She walked out of the office without another word, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. Michael and I sat there in stunned silence. "What just happened?" he asked. "Why is she so angry?" I did not have an answer, but I had a feeling. A cold, creeping feeling that this was not the end of something, but the beginning. The first sign of trouble came exactly 12 days later. Patricia called me at work. I was in my studio at the time, a small converted garage behind my apartment where I did my painting. I had been an artist since I was old enough to hold a brush, and while I was not famous or wealthy, I made enough from commissions and gallery shows to support myself. My father had always been proud of that. proud that I had found my own path, even when he could have easily handed me a position at his company. Patricia's voice was tense when I answered. "Emma," she said, "can you come to my office this afternoon? Something has come up." I felt my stomach drop. "What kind of something?" "It is better if we discuss it in person. Bring Michael if you can reach him." Michael was in his last year of graduate school, working toward a master's degree in environmental science. He was passionate about saving the world, about fighting climate change, about making things better for future generations. He was exactly the kind of person our parents had raised us to be. I called him, and he agreed to meet me at Patricia's office at 4 o'clock. When we arrived, Patricia's usual calm demeanor was gone. She looked worried, genuinely worried, in a way I had never seen before. She sat us down and slid a document across the desk. "This was delivered to my office this morning," she said, "by your aunt's attorney." I picked up the document and began to read. The words swam before my eyes, not quite making sense at first. It was a legal challenge to my father's will, a claim that the document we had seen was not valid, that there was another will, a more recent will, that superseded it. According to this claim, my father had written a new will just 2 weeks before his death, a will that left everything, the house, the business, the bank accounts, all of it, to Sandra Collins. The room went very quiet. "This is insane," I finally said. "Dad never mentioned changing his will. He never even hinted at it." Patricia nodded slowly. "I know. But your aunt claims to have a copy of this new will, signed and witnessed. If it is authentic, it would take precedence over the document I have on file." Michael's face had gone pale. "Aunt Sandra is trying to steal our inheritance?" "That is certainly how it appears," Patricia said. "But I want you to understand something. For this challenge to succeed, she would need to produce the original document, prove it was properly executed, and demonstrate that your father was of sound mind when he signed it. Those are significant hurdles." "Can she do that?" I asked. Patricia hesitated. "If the document is a forgery, then no. But if it is not, if she somehow convinced your father to change his will in his final days, then she has a legitimate case." I felt sick. My father had been grieving, lonely, vulnerable. Would he really have cut his own children out of his will for a sister he barely spoke to? It did not make sense. Nothing about this made sense. Michael and I spent the next several weeks in a kind of suspended nightmare. The legal process ground forward slowly, with motions and counter-motions, with document requests and depositions. Patricia worked tirelessly on our behalf, but she was honest with us about the challenges we faced. These cases, she explained, often come down to whose story is more believable, and juries are unpredictable. Aunt Sandra, meanwhile, was busy building her case. She gave interviews to local news outlets, painting herself as the victim of a family feud, the loving sister who had been unfairly excluded from her brother's life. She claimed that I had turned my father against her, that I had poisoned him against his own blood. She cried on camera, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, talking about how Richard had called her in his final days, begging for forgiveness, wanting to make things right. It was all lies. Every single word of it. But people believed her. That was the worst part. People I had known my entire life, neighbors and family friends, and even some of my father's employees, started looking at me differently. I heard the whispers. That poor Sandrartual. Emma was always so controlling. Maybe Richard really did want to change things. The isolation was suffocating. I stopped going to gallery openings, stopped returning phone calls, stopped leaving my apartment except when absolutely necessary. Michael was struggling too, his grades slipping as he tried to balance his coursework with the mounting legal nightmare. We held on to each other, two orphans in a storm, trying desperately to stay afloat. And then, about 3 months into this ordeal, I discovered something that changed everything. I was at my parents' house, sorting through my father's belongings. Patricia had suggested we do a thorough search for any documents that might help our case, any evidence of my father's state of mind in his final weeks. Michael was supposed to help me, but he had come down with a terrible flu, So I was there alone, going through boxes in the attic, trying not to cry every time I found something that reminded me of my mother. My father's filing system was legendary. He had boxes for everything, labeled in his careful handwriting: tax returns, business contracts, personal correspondence, medical records. I found birthday cards we had made him as children, love letters my mother had written during their courtship, photographs spanning 5 decades. But I also found something else. In a box labeled Sandra, Personal, I found a stack of letters. They were from my aunt, written to my father over a span of about 15 years. Some were typed, some were handwritten, and they painted a picture of their relationship that I had never known existed. The earliest letters were warm, sisterly, full of news about Sandra's travels and adventures. But as the years progressed, the tone changed. There were mentions of money, of loans my father had given her, of businesses that had failed, of investments that had gone wrong. By the most recent letters, from about 5 years ago, Sandra was openly bitter, accusatory. She blamed my father for not supporting her enough, for choosing his wife and children over his own sister, for being selfish and ungrateful. But it was the last letter in the stack that made my blood run cold. It was dated 3 years before my father's death. It was handwritten, the penmanship shaky, as if Sandra had been emotional when she wrote it. And it said this: "Richard, you have made your choice perfectly clear. Your precious children will inherit everything, and I will be left with nothing. After everything I have done for this family, after all the sacrifices I have made, this is how you repay me. But I want you to know something. I will not let this stand. One way or another, I will get what I deserve. You can change your will now, or you can force me to take matters into my own hands later. But make no mistake, brother, I will not be forgotten. If you die before you fix this, I will find a way. I always find a way. Your loving sister, Sandra." I sat there on the dusty attic floor, holding that letter in my trembling hands, reading those words over and over again. She had threatened him. 3 years before he died, she had explicitly threatened to find a way to take the inheritance, if he did not give it to her willingly. And now here she was, producing a mysterious new will, claiming my father had changed his mind at the last minute. It was not just suspicious, it was a confession written in her own hand. I called Patricia immediately. My voice was shaking as I read her the letter over the phone. She was silent for a long moment after I finished. "Emma," she said quietly, "do you understand what you have found?" "I think so," I said. "This is evidence of premeditation," she said. "Your aunt wrote down her intention to find a way to get the inheritance, regardless of your father's wishes. 3 years before his death. This directly contradicts her claim that Richard changed his mind voluntarily. What do we do now?" "Now," Patricia said, and I could hear the steel in her voice, "we go on the offensive." The next few weeks were a blur of legal strategy sessions, document analysis, and careful preparation. Patricia brought in a handwriting expert to compare the letter Sandra had written 3 years ago with the supposed new will she had produced. The expert's findings were damning. The signature on the new will was a nearly perfect copy of my father's, but there were subtle inconsistencies. The pressure points were wrong. The letter spacing was slightly off. Most damning of all, there were traces of pencil marks underneath the ink, suggesting someone had traced over a template. The will was a forgery, and the forger had made a critical mistake. But Patricia wanted more. She wanted to prove not just that the will was fake, but that Sandra had deliberately created it, that this was fraud with malicious intent. And for that, we needed more than circumstantial evidence. That was when I decided to do something risky, something that went against my every instinct for self-preservation. I decided to reach out to my aunt directly. Michael thought I was insane. We were sitting in my kitchen, going over the case files, when I told him my plan. He stared at me like I had grown a second head. "You want to meet with her?" he asked. "The woman who is trying to steal everything from us?" "I want to understand why," I said. "And maybe, if I can get her talking, she will slip up." Say something that proves what she has done. Emma, this is dangerous. She is clearly willing to do anything to get what she wants. I know, I said. But right now it is our word against hers. If I can record her admitting something, anything, we could end this. Michael was quiet for a long moment. And if she realizes what you are doing? I met his eyes. Then I deal with the consequences. I called Aunt Sandra the next day. She was surprised to hear from me, but she agreed to meet. She suggested a coffee shop in town, neutral ground. I agreed, and we set a time for the following afternoon. I did not tell Patricia what I was planning. I knew she would advise against it, would tell me it was too risky, that anything I obtained might not be admissible. But I was beyond caring about the legal niceties. I needed to look this woman in the eye and understand how someone I had loved so much could betray me so completely. The coffee shop was busy when I arrived, full of students and young professionals tapping away at laptops. I chose a table in the back corner, where we would have some privacy, but where I could be seen by plenty of witnesses. I was wearing a simple recording device, a small microphone hidden in my jacket lapel. In my state, recording conversations without consent was legally questionable, but I was willing to take that risk. Aunt Sandra arrived exactly on time, dressed impeccably as always in a cream-colored blouse and tailored pants. Her makeup was perfect, her hair styled in elegant waves. She looked like she was going to a garden party, not meeting the niece she was trying to rob. "Emma," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. "I am so glad you called." "Are you?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Of course. This whole situation has been such a nightmare. I never wanted it to come to this." I tilted my head, studying her face. "Really? Because from where I am sitting, it looks like you planned this very carefully." Her eyes flickered just for a moment, before her expression smoothed out again. "I do not know what you mean." "I mean the will," I said. "The one that conveniently appeared out of nowhere after my father died. The one that just happens to leave everything to you." "That was your father's choice," she said. "He wanted to make things right before he died." "Make things right?" I leaned forward. "After barely speaking to you for years? After you wrote him a letter threatening to find a way to take the inheritance if he did not give it to you?" Her mask slipped. I saw it happen, saw the surprise and then the fear flash across her face before she recovered. "I do not know what you are talking about." "I have the letter, Aunt Sandra. The one you wrote 3 years ago. The one where you told him you would find a way, one way or another." She was silent. Her hands had gone very still on the table. "You know," I said, "I used to wonder how you could do this to us, to Michael and me. We loved you. We trusted you. And then I read that letter, and I realized something. You never loved us at all. We were just obstacles in your way. You do not understand," she said, and her voice had changed. The sweet, concerned aunt was gone. In her place was someone harder, colder. "You have never understood. Richard owed me. He owed me for years of sacrifice, years of putting up with his perfect family and his perfect life while I struggled." "What did he owe you?" I asked. "Everything," she hissed. "He inherited the business from our parents. He got the house, the money, the reputation. And what did I get? Nothing. A few $1,000s and a pat on the head. Our parents always favored him, and he never shared. Not really. Not when it mattered. So you decided to take what you thought you deserved. I decided to claim what was rightfully mine, by forging a will." The words hung in the air between us. I watched her face, watched the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was trying to figure out how much I really knew, whether this was a trap, whether she could still salvage the situation. "I did not forge anything," she said finally. "Your father signed that will himself." "Then you will not mind having the signature analyzed by experts," I said, "because we already have. And their findings are very interesting." Her face went pale. "You are bluffing." "Am I? Would you like me to read you the expert's report? The part about the pencil traces underneath the ink?" The part about the pressure point inconsistencies? The part where they conclude, with 98% certainty, that the signature was traced from another document? She stood up so abruptly that her chair crashed backward. Several people in the coffee shop looked up, startled. "This conversation is over," she said. "Running away? That does not seem like you, Aunt Sandra. I thought you always found a way." She stared at me, and in her eyes I saw something that made my stomach twist. It was hatred, pure, undiluted hatred. The mask was completely gone now, and the person standing before me bore no resemblance to the aunt I had loved. "You think you are so clever," she whispered. "You think you have won, but you have no idea what I am capable of." "Actually," I said, standing up to face her, "I think I have a pretty good idea. And I think you are about to find out what happens when you underestimate the people you try to destroy." She turned and walked out of the coffee shop without another word. But I had what I needed, her own words, recorded on the device in my jacket. Not a full confession, maybe, but enough. Enough to prove that she knew about the letter. Enough to prove that she believed she was owed the inheritance. Enough to put cracks in her carefully constructed story. I delivered the recording to Patricia the next morning. She listened to it twice, her expression growing more intense with each replay. "You took a significant risk," she said when it was finished. "I know, but it paid off." She admitted knowing about the letter. She admitted believing she was owed the inheritance. And most importantly, she did not deny forging the will when you accused her directly. She just said your father signed it himself. Which is not the same thing as saying it is genuine. Exactly. Patricia pushed her glasses up her nose. Combined with the handwriting expert's analysis and the letter itself, we have a very strong case. What happens now? Now, she said with a small smile, we go to court. The court date was set for 6 weeks later. In that time, Sandra's attorney tried everything to get the case dismissed. They argued that the recording was inadmissible, that the handwriting analysis was inconclusive, that the letter from 3 years ago was irrelevant to the current proceedings. The judge denied every motion. I learned something about Sandra during this period, something that helped me understand her desperation. Patricia's investigator dug into her financial records and discovered that my aunt was broke, not just temporarily short on cash, but deep in debt. She had been living far beyond her means for years, maxing out credit cards, taking out loans, making increasingly risky investments that had all gone bust. Her elegant clothes and glamorous lifestyle were a facade covering a financial disaster. She needed my father's money. Not wanted, needed. Without it, she was facing bankruptcy, losing her apartment, losing everything she had built her identity around. That did not make what she did any less wrong, but it helped me understand. She was not just greedy, she was desperate, and desperate people do terrible things. The trial lasted 5 days. Patricia was brilliant, methodical, devastatingly effective. She walked the jury through the evidence piece by piece, the handwriting analysis, the letter from 3 years ago, the recording from the coffee shop, the financial records showing Sandra's mounting debts. Sandra's attorney tried to paint her as a victim, a woman wronged by a brother who had never appreciated her, a family cast aside by ungrateful heirs. But the evidence was too strong. Every time he tried to establish a narrative, Patricia knocked it down with facts. The moment I will never forget came on the 4th day of the trial. Sandra had taken the stand to testify in her own defense, and Patricia was cross-examining her. It had been a long afternoon, and Sandra looked tired, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Patricia held up the letter, the one from 3 years ago. "You wrote this," she said. "Is that correct?" "Yes," Sandra admitted, "but it does not mean what you are suggesting. I was angry when I wrote it. I did not actually intend to do anything. You wrote, and I quote, 'If you die before you fix this, I will find a way.' What way were you referring to, Mrs. Collins?" Sandra hesitated. "I do not remember. It was 3 years ago. I say a lot of things when I am upset. Things like threatening to take matters into your own hands. That was not a threat. It was an expression of frustration." Patricia nodded slowly. So when your brother died without changing his will, and a new will conveniently appeared that left everything to you, that was just a coincidence? I did not forge anything. The will is real. Richard signed it. Then why? Patricia asked, moving closer to the witness stand. Are there pencil trace marks underneath the ink of your brother's signature? Sandra's face went white. I do not know. You do not know, Patricia repeated. You do not know why the handwriting expert found evidence that someone traced over your brother's signature on this allegedly authentic document? There could be many explanations. Name one. Silence. Sandra looked around the courtroom like a trapped animal. Her attorney objected, but the judge overruled him. I watched as she struggled to find an answer, any answer, that would save her. I cannot explain it, she finally said. Patricia turned to face the jury. No further questions. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found in our favor on every count. The forged will was declared invalid. My father's original will was upheld, and Sandra was referred to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. But sitting there in that courtroom, watching my aunt be led away by her attorney, I felt only exhaustion and a deep, aching sadness. She had done this to herself. She had made the choice to lie, to forge, to manipulate, to betray. But she was still my aunt. She was still the woman who had taught me to make paper flowers when I was 5, who had told me stories about traveling the world, who had made me believe that adventure was always possible if you were brave enough to chase it. That woman was gone now. Maybe she had never really existed at all. Michael squeezed my hand as we walked out of the courthouse. It is over, he said. Is it? I asked. He looked at me, understanding in his eyes. The legal part is over. The rest, he said, that is going to take longer. He was right. The months that followed were complicated. The estate was finally transferred to our names, the business placed under the management of my father's trusted vice president, until we could decide what to do with it. Michael and I sold the family home. Neither of us could bear to live there anymore, surrounded by memories that were now tainted by everything that had happened. Sandra faced criminal charges for fraud and forgery. She took a plea deal to avoid trial, accepting 2 years of probation, community service, and a requirement to pay back the legal fees her false claim had cost the estate. It was not prison, but it was something. It was consequences. The social and professional fallout was worse for her than any legal punishment. The news coverage of the trial had been extensive, and Sandra's reputation was destroyed. The society friends who had surrounded her for years suddenly could not remember her name. The credit lines she had been living on were closed. The apartment she loved was sold to cover her debts. Last I heard, she was living in a small town in Florida, working as a receptionist in a doctor's office. A far cry from the glamorous life she had always pretended to live. I wish I could say I felt satisfaction at her downfall, but the truth is more complicated than that. I felt relief that the ordeal was over. I felt vindicated that the truth had come out. But I also felt loss, grief for the aunt I thought I had known, mourning for a relationship that had never been what I believed it was. Michael handled it differently than I did. He threw himself into his work, graduating at the top of his class, getting a job with an environmental nonprofit that let him channel his grief into something productive. He met someone, a kind woman named Julie, who understood his gentle heart and his complicated past. They got married last spring, in a small ceremony on a beach at sunset. I gave a toast about family, about the bonds that sustain us and the strength we find in each other. I did not mention Sandra. As for me, I took some time to heal. I traveled for a while, using some of the inheritance money to visit the places my aunt had always talked about: Paris, Rome, Barcelona. But instead of seeing the glamour she had described, I found beauty in simpler things. The way the light hit the Seine at dusk, the sound of church bells echoing through narrow Italian streets, the warmth of strangers who became friends, however briefly. I came back to Connecticut eventually, but I moved to a new town, one where I did not have a history. where people knew me only as Emma, the artist who made beautiful things. I opened a small studio, started taking commissions again, rebuilt a life that felt entirely my own. There is one more thing I need to tell you, one more piece of this story that took me a long time to understand. About a year after the trial, I received a letter. It was from Sandra, written on cheap stationery that was nothing like the elegant, cream-colored paper she used to favor. Her handwriting was shakier than I remembered, the words smaller and more cramped. Emma, I do not expect you to read this. I do not expect forgiveness, and I do not deserve it. But I need you to know something. What I did was wrong. Not just the forgery, not just the lies, but all of it. The years of resentment, the jealousy, the way I blamed your father for things that were never his fault. I spent my whole life believing I was owed something, that the world was unfair to me, that I deserved more than I had, and that belief destroyed everything I ever loved. Your father was not perfect, but he was a good man, and he loved his family, including me, in his own way. I was too consumed by my own bitterness to see it. I am sorry for what I put you and Michael through. I am sorry for the pain I caused. I am sorry I was not the aunt you deserved. I do not expect you to respond. I just needed you to know. Sandra. I read that letter many times. I thought about responding, about reaching out, about trying to salvage something from the wreckage of our relationship. But in the end, I decided against it. Some wounds are too deep to heal. Some trust, once broken, can never be fully restored. Sandra had made her choice years ago, when she decided that her resentment was more important than her love for us. My choice now was to move forward without her. I kept the letter, though. I put it in a box with the other letters, the ones she had written to my father over the years. Sometimes I take it out and read it, trying to understand the woman who wrote it, trying to find compassion for someone who had shown me none. The inheritance is still there, still growing, carefully managed by professionals who know more about finance than I ever will. Michael and I made a decision early on about what to do with the business. We kept Collins Construction running, but we brought in new leadership, people who shared my father's values of quality and integrity. We set up a scholarship fund for students from working-class families who want to study engineering or construction. We created a foundation in our parents' names that supports community building projects in underserved areas. It feels right, using the money this way. It feels like what my parents would have wanted. I am 32 years old now. A lot has changed since that terrible year when I lost my parents and discovered who my aunt really was. I am stronger than I was then, more confident in my ability to survive whatever life throws at me. But I am also more cautious, more careful about who I trust and how much of myself I give away. People ask me sometimes if I ever regret fighting back, if I ever wish I had just let Sandra have the money and walked away from the conflict. I always give the same answer. The money was not the point. It was never really about the money. It was about truth, about justice, about refusing to let someone rewrite my father's legacy for their own selfish purposes. My parents worked their entire lives to build something meaningful. They raised me to stand up for what is right, even when it is hard, even when it hurts. If I had let Sandra get away with her scheme, I would have betrayed everything they taught me. I would have been complicit in the destruction of their memory. That was something I could never accept. The revenge, if you want to call it that, was not in Sandra's punishment. It was in the truth, in exposing what she had done, in proving that her lies could not stand up to scrutiny, in showing the world who she really was. The revenge was justice. And maybe that is the most important lesson I learned from all of this. Revenge does not have to be violent or destructive. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to be a victim, refusing to let the people who hurt you win, refusing to give up when the fight seems impossible. Sandra tried to steal my inheritance, but her own secret letter, written in her own hand years before she put her plan into action, destroyed everything she had built. Her own words became the evidence that proved her guilt. Her own desperation led her to make mistakes that a calmer person would never have made. In the end, she was undone not by me, but by herself, by the resentment she had nurtured for decades, the entitlement that blinded her to the consequences of her actions, the arrogance that made her believe she was smarter than everyone else in the room. I think about her sometimes, living her quiet life in Florida, stripped of the illusions that once defined her. I wonder if she has found any peace, any acceptance of who she really is without the masks and the pretenses. I hope so, for her sake. But I also know that is not my responsibility anymore. My responsibility is to myself, to Michael, to the people I love and the life I am building. My responsibility is to honor my parents' memory by living with integrity, by creating beautiful things, by being the kind of person they raised me to be. The betrayal changed me. It left scars that will never fully heal. But it also showed me my own strength, my own resilience, my own capacity to fight for what matters. And in a strange way, I am grateful for that. If you are listening to this story, if you are going through something similar, if someone you trusted has turned against you and you do not know how you will survive, I want you to hear this. You are stronger than you think. The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how carefully the lies are constructed. And justice, real justice, is possible if you are willing to fight for it. Sandra tried to steal everything from me, but she failed. And in the end, her own secret letter became the weapon that destroyed her plan. That is my story, the story of betrayal, of justice, of a family torn apart, and the truth that finally set me free. I hope you never have to go through something like this, but if you do, remember, the people who betray us often carry the seeds of their own destruction. Sometimes we just have to be patient enough to watch them grow. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves and the people who truly love you. They are worth more than any inheritance.